So I saw a stat recently that I found really, really surprising. About 2% of the population in the United States was born with the help of some sort of assisted reproductive technology. Think about that. That's how important IVF is. It's important to the very people who you know. It's important to so many families who want to choose life and grow their families. Yet we have seen the headlines. IVF is under threat right now. The ability of people to control their own families, to grow their families, has never been in as much peril as it has since the Dobbs decision. I'm Kimberly Atkins-Stor, and this is Justice by Design. This is where we talk to the people who are on the ground, rolling up their sleeves and finding solutions to the biggest issues that we face as a society. And the battle over reproductive freedom is certainly one of those issues that affect all of us, really. And that's why I am so pleased to be joined by IVF and reproduction specialist, Dr. Eve Feinberg. Eve, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me on this podcast and truly for covering what I think is probably one of the biggest elections that our country faces. And this, to me, is one of the biggest issues at hand in this upcoming election.
I could not agree with you more. So before we get started in our conversation, first introduce yourself to the listeners and let them know what you do in this space.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Eve Feinberg. I'm a reproductive endocrinologist and infertility specialist. I'm a full professor of obstetrics and gynecology and reproductive endocrinology and infertility at Northwestern University in Chicago. I also serve as the REI Fellowship Program Director, and I sit on the executive board of the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, and I also sit on the National Medical Committee of Planned Parenthood. So really wearing both those hats at both spectrums of reproductive choice.
Yeah, that sounded like about 17 hats to me, but I really appreciate all of that work. So I want to start this conversation to say it's not just all of those hats that you wear that make you an expert in this space, but it's also your personal experience. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, my personal experience is really vast. And I would say my personal experience going through IVF, but also my personal experience as a physician who takes care of patients every single day who are battling infertility and who want to grow their families. My husband and I needed assistance we have 3 children, and we needed assistance to have each of our 3 children, and they wouldn't be here without my colleagues and the brilliant minds in this field. And so I very much appreciate both the science and the humanity that goes behind the field of reproductive medicine.
So I want to start with some good news, which is the vast majority of Americans strongly support the ability of people to use IVF to grow their families, to create the lives that they want. And it wasn't always the case. When we go back to, I remember when I was younger and I heard about, quote unquote, test tube babies, and it seemed very scary and, very brave new world. But now we don't think about it that way at all. We are grateful that we have solutions to fertility issues that so many people in America face. But here we are at this time, also seeing the greatest threat to IVF and other reproductive technologies after the Dobbs decision. And it really was brought to life by a decision in Alabama, which had to be quickly reversed, that temporarily halted all IVF treatments in that state for a period of time before the legislature could go back and correct it. And I just want to get a sense. I think when a lot of people hear, okay, you hear the former president say, oh yeah, that happened, but it's fixed. Everything's fixed. But for so many people, it was not. Talk about what it was like for people who either wanted IVF, who were in the middle of IVF, who had begun IVF, to go through at a time where suddenly the door was shut on it.
Yeah, and it's not unlike, I mean, early in the COVID-19 pandemic, we stopped doing IVF as a field for a period of about 6 weeks when there was just so much uncertainty about COVID and the implications of COVID on reproduction. And so I thought that was like a once in a lifetime event where IVF would be shut down. And so when the LePage ruling came in and they basically said that it was manslaughter, destruction of embryos was manslaughter, I think rightfully so, all of the physicians in Alabama felt like they could no longer safely practice IVF if you were going to consider a fertilized egg to have the same legal statute as an actual child. And scientifically, that's, it's really incorrect to think about a fertilized egg having all the rights of a citizen. But if you have that personhood agreement in there, that clause of personhood, which sadly is happening around the country in multiple states, if you consider a fertilized egg a person, then any such destruction of that fertilized egg can lead to criminal charges like manslaughter for the person or entity that, quote, destroys that egg. And that's really problematic on so many different levels, not just in the field of reproductive medicine, but for pregnant patients or for pregnant people. If you have a miscarriage and you are in a domestic dispute with your partner, they can claim manslaughter, that you killed your child. If you are in a car accident and you have a miscarriage, the at-fault driver could potentially be charged with manslaughter. And so it's a very dangerous precedent.
And talk a little bit more about that because, and as a physician, when you have lawmakers, judges making what they quickly learned after Dobbs was literal life and death decisions about others, people who don't have medical background, don't even fully understand physically what is happening in the body during the reproductive process, making these rules of the road and drawing lines in places that don't make medical sense. Let's start there. As a physician, when you see that, I mean, we're not talking about licensing boards. We're talking about people who have absolutely no connection with the medical field.
Yeah, and I think it's the conflation of religion and politics, really. And I think that we pride ourselves on being a society that has separation of church and state. And I respect people's beliefs that they think that life begins at fertilization. And I think that's a religious debate. That's a moral debate on when do you consider that life begins. But from a very legal point of view, a citizen is somebody who deserves the protection of the state or of the country. And Roe, where I think that this is really important, is Roe drew that line of viability. And that is not without flaws as well. But at least medically, it's a very sensible place to say, like, this person can live outside of the mother's body. It can be a living, breathing human, and therefore it deserves protection. And whether that's 24 weeks or 23 weeks or 22, I think that is medically debatable. But to say that an egg that has been fertilized by a sperm enjoys the same protections as a citizen scientifically is just not accurate. And so I think people can believe that that represents life, and I respect that belief, but that shouldn't translate into that fertilized egg is now a citizen of the state of Alabama, which is effectively what they said. And the reason that it doesn't make sense has a lot to do with what the reproductive potential of any given egg is. And I think that people grossly overestimate the likelihood that a fertilized egg will turn into a child. I wish, and I say this all the time, I did 6 embryo transfers today. And if I'm lucky and on a very good day, maybe 4 of those patients will be pregnant.
Yeah.
But it's just not, that's not how science works.
Yeah. And it's not just, and yeah, having had many friends who also went through IVF, and not just the time and the, the heartbreak that followed time and time again in that process, but also the expense, which is sort of what got Alabama into this whole debate, was that there was a need to try to legally quantify the value of an embryo if something happened to it, if it was somehow destroyed, and which is devastating to someone, but they decided, okay, well, it's just like a life, it's manslaughter if something happens intentionally to this. But as you very much pointed out, that is not the case, that it's a chance at best that could become life at some later point if all of untold other factors align. But just talk about, you see patients going through this, and there is a process where they go through, and it involves treatments, and it involves a lot of things, and time and waiting and timing. And then if you happily get a fertilized egg and then it is stored at that point, what do you think should happen at that point? How should that be treated? Know that that's not accurately personhood. It's not a person, but it's something of value, and it needs to be protected. And right now, the laws are not providing the protection in many states.
Yeah, we consider a human embryo to be the potential to have life. It's not garbage. It's not something that we discard carelessly. It's not something that we don't value. We value embryos. We treat them with lots of love and care. Our IVF clinics are open 365 days a year. We take extraordinary care of the human tissue that is in our laboratory. But we also very realistically know that for anyone that has an embryo transfer, that it's, at best a 60% likelihood to become a child, and at worst, probably less than 5%. And so equating that with an actual human life is just not scientifically correct. Just to give an example, when you do a treatment cycle such as in vitro fertilization, we put women on hormones. They undergo a surgical procedure where we take the eggs out. And then of all the eggs that we take out, probably about 75% of them are capable of fertilization, and about 75% of them will actually fertilize. And then to go from the day after the egg retrieval, where we see that the egg is fertilized, until the point where we are able to transfer the embryo, only about 25 to 50% of everything that's fertilized actually becomes an embryo that's suitable to put back into the woman's body. And so there's a huge amount of attrition that happens in the IVF laboratory from fertilization to what we call blastocyst development, which is the most highly developed embryo prior to that final stage of implantation. And then depending on the age of the woman, the likelihood that that embryo is chromosomally normal versus abnormal, there's a linear relationship with the age of the woman as to what the likelihood that that embryo is euploid or normal. And so in a 32-year-old woman, it's probably only 60% likely that that embryo is normal. And in a 40-year-old woman, it's 20% likely.
Wow.
And so that further decreases the likelihood that that embryo would have a chance at life.
Wow. And that all is at great emotional and financial expense as well. So I want to talk about solutions. That's what this podcast is about. So, short of reversing Dobbs, which I've talked about in an earlier podcast, that we can link to that one because that we painted a road toward how Dobbs might be overturned someday. What can be done right now? What do you need as a fertility expert and practitioner in order to be able to protect your patients and ensure that people can have a choice to have the families that they want?
Yeah, so I think all personhood laws need not pass.
Mm-hmm.
There should not be a law in any state in the United States that gives personhood status to an embryo, period. So you cannot have a right to protect IVF in the same state that has personhood as a statue. And so, excuse my legal terms if they're not correct, but basically those two are completely at odds. You cannot talk out of both sides of your mouth and say, we're going to vote for the right to protect IVF, but also our state supports personhood, because you cannot call an embryo a person. And so I think that the solution is to have both, to have the right to protect IVF as a law that should be passed federally. Mm-hmm. But I also think that any mention of personhood as it pertains to an embryo should not be law. And it's as simple as that.
Yeah. And it's so important because this is one of many reasons, right, that personhood for an embryo it needs to stop. It's not just that it's definitionally and medically inaccurate. It's not just because it imperils the ability for people to use IVF and other treatments. But there's a whole host of other reasons, right? When you give personhood to an embryo, you naturally reduce the personhood and the autonomy of the person whose body the embryo is in, or whose the embryo could possibly be in. There are a host of other reasons, but it's just at the bottom of it, it's just not accurate. It's just false. And, I take your point too about religion and morality, and it's important for that to be protected. But just think of so many religions. First of all, I consider myself a Christian, and I do not think that an embryo is a person. There are a lot of religions that put in their mind life as starting at different points, whether it's quickening, whether it's birth. It's so many different things. Its morality is not one size fits all, even though our laws are trying to make it that way. So a lot of this feels like common sense, Eve, but I think we need to say it plainly to just hammer home the point to people.
Cancer cells have life. They take on a life of their own. They multiply, they spread, and I don't hear arguments that we shouldn't be giving chemotherapy. We destroy human life in various forms in medicine to save lives. And I'm not arguing that an embryo is not life. Like, that's a religious belief that certain sects of certain religions believe that life begins with fertilization.
Yep.
It's an entirely different, and I'm not arguing that. Yep. I think every person is entitled to their own, deeply personal religious beliefs.
That is correct.
If you have those beliefs and you come to see me as your physician, I will respect those beliefs. And there are ways to do in vitro fertilization where you can honor individuals' beliefs about how they want to proceed.
Yeah.
What I'm asking, though, is that your religious beliefs don't become law and interfere with my religious beliefs or my patient's religious beliefs, that it's not black and white, and it's not a one size fits all, and it's not that every embryo is a person. That's just not scientifically correct. Mm-hmm. And so I think as a physician, we always try to respect each patient's individual autonomy. We try to respect their religious beliefs, their sociocultural beliefs. And I think that there is a way for those very few patients that don't want to destroy an embryo, that don't want to put an embryo at risk for being destroyed, there are ways that we can pursue IVF in such a fashion to meet the needs of that person. Arguably, it reduces the success of the procedure. It makes it more risky. It's not how IVF should be practiced. Italy went through 10 years of law that IVF had to be practiced in that way. And after 10 years of triplet pregnancies, low success, danger to the woman, those laws were changed. And so why are we potentially trying to argue to create law for one religion?
Yeah. So recently, an effort to do what you say is needed, codify protection of IVF on a national level, failed in a vote in Congress. What would you say to those lawmakers and their constituents who voted against it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's shocking. It's actually pretty horrible. And I think that it's offensive to not just to women, but this is actually one of the few laws that I think is actually offensive to men. It's basically like saying, our government does not value you and doesn't think that you are worthy to have a child.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Eve Feinberg, thank you so much for taking time today to join me to talk about this crucial issue and what is needed to solve it. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, one of the things that I love most about what Eve said in our discussion is that this is an issue that isn't just important to women. You know, when we're talking about reproductive rights, we're always often talking about a woman's right to choose and the attack on women's rights and what it means to women. This is important to everybody. This is important to men too. Men want to start families as much as women do. Men are born, sometimes using IVF, the same way that we all are. Families are families, and decisions that affect people's ability to have a family affect every gender. You know, women don't have a monopoly on that. Yes, the burden of an attack on reproductive rights is disproportionately borne, no pun intended, by women. But men should be in this fight too. I want to see more of their voices in this, more demands from them to their lawmakers to do better, more pushback when those rights and freedoms are under attack. This is your fight too, fellas. I really loved that. I'm Kimberly Atkins-Stor. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode of Justice by Design. You can find Justice by Design on our Facebook channel. You can also find it wherever you get your podcasts. And you know what? Follow us. Give us 5 stars because that helps other people find it too. And I will see you next week.